Hello, thank you for joining us on the third day of the 20th anniversary edition of Hong Kong International Literary Festival. My name is Catherine Platt and I am the festival director. We have online events all this weekend and all of next week as well. And if you're in Hong Kong, you can also attend live events at Asia Society and Tai Kwun. Take a look at our website, festival.org.hk, for all the details. We have 76 events running until the 15th of November. Today's session, I'm very happy to be introducing. It resonates really well with our festival theme, present tense, future perfect. And it is a session that's generated a lot of interest already. Our speaker, Xiaowei Wang, works at the intersection of art, technology, ecology, and education. And her fascinating research into the future of food, especially in rural China, raises a lot of interesting questions about how we will produce and consume food in the years ahead. So we're really delighted she's joining us, and also very pleased to have Shazeda Ahmed from Stanford University moderating the talk today. I'll introduce Shazeda in just a minute, but I want to run through a few points about the Crowdcast platform if you're here for the first time. You can post comments in the chat on the right-hand side. If you have a question, it would help if you can put it in the Q&A box at the bottom right of the screen. Shazeda will pick up your questions from there. There's also going to be a green call to action button at the bottom underneath the screen, which if you click on that, it will connect you to our festival bookseller, Bookazine, their website where you can buy Xiaowei's book. All of the authors appear for free at the festival. The best way to thank them is to support their work and buy their books. So we hope you'll click through there and take a look. The event is going to remain on Crowdcast until the end of November, so you can watch on demand anytime, and we'll be adding a new version with Chinese subtitles within 48 hours. So finally, I'd like to thank all of our cultural partners, sponsors, and donors for their generous support. And in particular, today, we're grateful to the US Consulate General of Hong Kong and Macau, who are supporting this session. And I'd also like to acknowledge an ongoing grant from the Standing Committee on Language Education and Research here in Hong Kong. Now then, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator today. Shazeda Ahmed is a doctoral candidate at the University of California at Berkeley School of Information. She's currently also a pre-doctoral fellow at 2 Stanford University research centers. I think she might have to correct me if I'm wrong about this. The Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence and the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Shazeda has worked as a researcher for Upturn, the Mercator Institute for China Studies, Ranking Digital Rights, and the Citizen Lab. Her doctoral dissertation research investigates how tech firms and the Chinese government are collaborating on the country's social credit system. That sounds like another talk we should be having, maybe at a future festival. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Shazeda now to introduce Xiaowei, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Xiaowei Wang is a technologist, a filmmaker, an artist, and a writer. The creative director at Logic Magazine, Xiaowei's work encompasses community-based and public art projects, data visualization, technology, ecology, and education. Their projects have been finalists for the Index Design Awards and featured by the New York Times, the BBC, CNN, Vice, and elsewhere. And their book, Blockchain Chicken Farm and Other Stories of Tech in China's Countryside, is out now. I'm so excited to discuss this with you, Xiaowei. Can we go ahead and launch into questions? I don't see Xiaowei. Is that okay? Oh, there you are. Great. Okay. Hi.
Hello.
Congratulations on this book. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for agreeing to do this conversation. Full disclosure to the audience, Shazeda and I live only a few miles away from each other, and we were just having noodles this past Sunday.
Xiaowei, that's something that you have to add to the bio, is that you're an excellent cook. And this was all outdoors, so just for everyone to know. This was one of my favorite books I've read this year, if not my favorite book. I read Middlemarch this year, so like I feel like it's hard, but your book is lovely. And I will say this is my favorite book I've ever read about China, but in a way, it's not really a China book, despite all of your research taking place in China, because you bring it back around to so many global issues. So I want to dive in. And one of the first things I want to talk about, we do this at the very beginning. We talk about this concept of metronormativity. So I guess the way I would distill that is like, it's this idea that cities are inherently, you know, these kind of like beacons of progress and more advanced, people are more sophisticated. And so the countryside, you know, alternatively is not. You weave this throughout the book so beautifully, right? You talk about how metronormativity doesn't just reshape society in cities, it does in the countryside, right? You have the elderly kind of left alone as young people leave villages for cities, and then these young people end up having this kind of like precarious social and economic status in the cities. You know, they become over-policed. Like, we can go into kind of all of that, but I really want to start, because you do such a good job of like grounding the book there throughout, and ask you, like, how did you come to this concept? You know, as like a cool city person, what initially attracted you to doing research in the countryside and this project?
Yeah, that's a great question and super close to my heart. So there is kind of parallel threads, which is, you know, a couple years ago, starting to go to Shenzhen more and spending time at the Shenzhen Open Innovation Lab, which is this really fantastic place. And the director there, David Lee, he kind of gave me this tip, which was like, well, Shenzhen's great and all, but if you want to see something that's actually really fascinating about tech and like these bigger dynamics, go to the countryside. So I kind of kept that in the back of my pocket, and I was like, okay, like, you know, like everyone loves to visit the countryside. Like, as city people, we have all these images of it as like this very relaxing, idyllic place. And so then the other thread was reading a lot of queer theory. And so Judith / Jack Halberstam is the person who coined that term metronormativity. And, you know, I had stumbled like through a couple of friends into these Instagram or social media accounts that are all about like queerness in the countryside and like trying to bring more visibility to queer communities in the American countryside. And metronormativity is really like, well, you know, in order for queer communities to feel safe in rural areas, there also needs to be a heightened level of visibility and challenging the idea that like, okay, we just moved to the city and that's it. And like, now like you're in San Francisco, like the gay capital of the world. And so in some strange way, like those two ideas got, you know, braided together, and just going to the Chinese countryside really being presented with a level of history, both personal history of, you know, I think like many mainland Chinese families, like family who went from the countryside into the city, that kind of migration. And yeah, wanting to untangle what it means like to be rural, especially in the world today where so much of life surrounds like being modern and being urban.
Awesome. That's such a cool journey. And I mean, there's so much I like about how you describe the countryside in this book, right? Like when you walk us through, and this is like one of my favorite things, is when you elegantly give us like a little bit of academic history and sort of like just a little bit from kind of every discipline. And it's so like perfectly condensed that it's accessible to everyone. It's brief, and it like really gets it. Like, this book is so slim, you know, I'm just like very impressed. But you talk about, well, there's kind of two things. You talk about TVEs, or these like town and village enterprises, and how when China's economy opened up and reformed, right, tried to become a market economy in the 80s, the countryside was where the entrepreneurial action was, right? People were trying out business models that had never been tried before. And this kind of contributed to this, like, you know, experimental, exciting, like economic revitalization. And so you're bringing it back to the present, right? And we can walk through any examples from the book that you want of, like, you know, everything from Taobao villages to, you know, the blockchain chicken farm. Like, these are experiments happening in the countryside. Something I love is that you don't over-romanticize the countryside. Like, you describe it so respectfully, and you point out the ingenuity and kind of like the daring creativity of people who have these businesses, but you don't like glorify or romanticize them. So I love that. But I wanted to ask, some of what I think is really interesting that you get at in the interviews is a few of the people you talk to point out, right? Like, let's say like the guy with the Taobao village, which I would love for you to describe. Like, he started making costumes, selling them on Taobao. That became really popular. And then the government noticed and wanted to make that the model for everywhere else. So why don't you walk us through the story of the Taobao village and the government's involvement? And then the thing I want to ask you about that in particular is, do you think there will continue to be room for innovation as like the government realizes that there's all this creativity in the villages and they want to scale it up? You know, that seems to me inorganic. You know, we talk a little, or throughout the book, there's other examples of how the countryside is becoming more surveilled, right? And the original idea with the TVEs was because you're in the country, away from the eyes of the government and the cities, you can kind of experiment more freely. So yeah, walk us through a little bit Taobao village history and like where you think innovation in the countryside might go in spite of, or you know, now that the government is paying so much more attention.
Yeah. So the funny enough, I remember spending Christmas with you in Hangzhou like 2 years ago. And it reminds me of, you know, how, I don't know if you feel this, but especially in looking at China, there is this sense of like decentralized authoritarianism. Like, everything feels really tightly controlled in cities. But then once you just make your way out of cities into the countryside, like things, like it's so much about like province level directives or like what people are doing in different provinces rather than this like, okay, the like government has total, the like state level government has total oversight over everything in the provinces. And so it did like, I think part of my attraction to the countryside was also this like room for expansion and possibility. I love the Taobao story. So, you know, I visited a few Taobao villages, and there were definitely villages where it was actually really boring and linear because, you know, they had some young, new, like, Communist Party official who is like straight out of uni and excited to like go down to the countryside and change things. And that official would be like, okay, we're going to become a Taobao village. It's this thing. And it, you know, people started having workshops and very kind of linear economic development process. But this one place that I visited, which was in Shandong, the first entrepreneur in the village, he had to move back home, similar to so many stories, because he had to take care of his family. His wife, who was working in like a sand factory, her back kind of gave out. And so he was like, all right, we're going back home. It's cheaper to live there. Our kids can, you know, like grow up in this environment without the stress of like not having access to good education in the cities. And so he had heard of selling costumes, like he would make like Snow White costumes or the Monkey King, like Sun Wukong costumes and all of these. And he was like, oh, well, then I learned you could put them on the internet through Taobao. And it was really fascinating because he was telling me stories like, oh, well, I actually didn't know how to use Pinyin. So he took his daughter's Pinyin textbook in order to figure out how to list things. And he was kind of just doing this like really bootstrapped, off the ground, borrowed money from relatives to kind of get the initial financial capital going, and no intervention from the local government. Once it got more successful, a local government official came by and was just like, what are you doing? This place is a mess. It's a fire hazard. And he was like, we're selling things on the computer. And the government official was like, on the computer, literally a Zoolander moment, which was like really kind of like hilarious to hear the official being described that way. And so then, of course, you know, the official like calls up people, is like, what is this Taobao thing? And then that's when it really becomes this concerted effort. The government's like, we're going to put in extremely fast fiber optic internet. We're going to economically develop this village so that it really becomes like a Taobao village. China's #1 Taobao village. Like, we'll tell Alibaba Rural Research Institute all about this. And so now, actually, the first entrepreneur, he got voted in as the village party secretary, which is not a job that he wanted at all, because he's pretty happy. He's pretty busy between raising kids, farming, and running his Taobao business. So it is really interesting, like, you know, there's been, I think, a lot of writers and historians who talk about that tension between local government and the peasants of China, and to see that arise and become folded in has been really fascinating. And yeah, so I think the one last thing I'll say to that point is the scholar Ananya Roy, she studies critical urban theory and specifically the urban-rural dynamic in India, but it has a lot of, you know, like overlaps where you have people from the countryside moving into the cities. And she argues that the urban, instead of viewing it as like, oh, about population density, it's actually a form of governing, of making things, of talking about economic development, about talking about like modernizing. And I think in the case of these Taobao villages, these rural places that are developing, it's very much like the urban is not about farming. It's just about how are we going to govern and tightly control a place.
Definitely. And I have a lot of questions about that, because you bring so many companies, you know, people who follow China have heard of, and of course, always there's so many companies we haven't heard of, but will like blow up and we'll know more about them later. You talk about, like you just mentioned, Alibaba, right? And their kind of like big data efforts that like collect, basically working with farmers to label data and help make decisions about when to plant certain crops or when to harvest them. There's so much there that I find really interesting. So one of the first things that I think we should talk about is pig farming. And you have this really great description of how the production of pigs is becoming standardized through this kind of like datafication, quantification. You know, you talk about quantification, which is making data and models seem complex as if they're, you know, completely rational. But you also talk about how like the consequences of some of these things are not as rosy as they're made to sound. So I wanted you to talk about the standardization of pig farming and zoonotic diseases, and kind of like, do you see those being mitigated risks? Given that, especially now that we're living through a pandemic, this has to be front of mind for companies like Alibaba.
Yeah, I was actually, and I feel like we've talked about this, where you like read an article about something that's happening in China, but it's not written by a reporter who typically writes on China. And so you're just like shaking your fist like, ah, and yeah, this happened. Yeah. There's like a New York Times article about Alibaba's pig farming using big data. And it was like, oh, Alibaba is like saving the day because there's this swine fever that's, you know, tearing through China, and Alibaba will now like use their automated AI farming in order to like guarantee like the safety of the pork supply. And that's like totally not what's happening, right? Like it's, that initiative started before swine fever, ASF hit China back in 2018. And it was actually like this bid to try and just have more cheap factory farmed pork. And in order to do any kind of factory farming at such a scale, of course, like standardization needs to happen, and in ways that I think so many of us would find it pretty unimaginable. Like, so when pigs get stressed, they bite each other's tails off. They're thinking like, oh, we could edit out, you know, pigs' tails. There'll be tailless pigs in the future. will only use certain breeds just to like make sure that, you know, when everything becomes standardized, like it's easier to like crunch through that data. We're not dealing with a certain level of complexity. And so, yeah, I think especially, you know, Rob Wallace, who is this epidemiologist, he's been sounding the alarm bell for years and years about how factory farming increases zoonotic disease because of many reasons, including habitat loss. And so it was really eerie to write about the pork and AI factory farming. And then towards the end of the book, when I was wrapping it up, it was 2019. I was in Hong Kong. I was reading about this zoonotic disease that was coming out of Wuhan, and just be like, oh, the thing that Rob Wallace has been talking about for years and years is maybe happening. And, you know, in some strange way, like, you know, the pork supply is diminished now, not both from swine fever, but also COVID supply chain issues. And yeah, it's this kind of surreal apocalyptic moment that, you know, of course, Alibaba is like, oh, but we can still like solve this issue with better technology.
Yeah, it's so funny you say that, because this quote I really love in the book is you say the same set of market forces that created the problem is now purportedly coming to the rescue, right? And you're talking about the problems around like agriculture and, you know, ensuring like that food is sourced safely, that from the cold chain, you know, from like transporting from the farm to the supermarket, that there isn't any tampering and it's high quality. You talk about that problem, but like that sentence applies here too, right? With contact tracing and all of the solutions, like this creates a whole new market of products that these same companies can sell, despite the fact that they might cause, you know, a future problem similar to this one. And you also talk about how neither the code nor the equipment nor the software, right, belongs to the farmers in the various like examples you look at. So I want to think about what it is you feel like the farmers still own or have control of in these situations. Because, and you can tell us a bit. I love the blockchain chicken farm story. One thing I'm not emphasizing enough is also this book is hilarious. Like it's like a long, excellent conversation with you where there's just like wonderful little witty one-liners, and you really need to tell us the blockchain chicken farm story, which ends perfectly.
Yeah, I'm sure like you get this feeling too when you're doing research in China and you like get invited to a place. Like it's like 75% of the time, like you get what you expect. And then the other 25% of the time is like question mark, or just like trying not to break out into laughter, or like trying to give the local official, like save them some face. And I feel like the blockchain chicken situation was definitely that. I was going there, you know, Sixth Tone had done this very in-depth piece about how this guy who was raising free-range chickens, like he couldn't sell them before because no one thought that he was really doing free-range chickens. And I show up and, you know, it's just like not at all what was represented. He didn't know what blockchain was. He didn't own any of the equipment. There's no way this person, Farmer Jiang, who was making like so little money before, that he would have the capital to invest in all this new like video cameras, QR codes, QR code bracelets, things like that. The local county official who was very excited that, you know, here was like a person from San Francisco visiting. He didn't know what blockchain was. He thought I was making fun of him. And I like had to pretend. I was like, no, it doesn't, you know, I was just asking. It got really awkward really fast.
Oh no.
Yeah. And yeah, in the end, you know, I think there was this tone of like, the company that had originally, sponsored this blockchain chicken project with the QR code on each of the chickens to like ensure that they were authentically free-range chickens. The company, like, they were just like, okay, we did this 1 year. It's kind of expensive because you're in a really remote part of Guizhou and you're like really far from a slaughterhouse. Your roads are like tiny and not that great. Good luck for the second year, and really left Farmer Jiang hanging out to dry. It's really kind of, it's both like a performance of trying to do poverty alleviation, but I think the other thing too is just like trying to extend that governing hand into the countryside.
I want to talk a little bit about that, like poverty alleviation and like the creation of labor. So in the book, right, you talk about all these new forms of labor that emerge with these tech advances. So, it's farmers labeling data for Alibaba's ET agricultural brain project, right? It's agricultural drone companies that hire farm service workers. And a lot of these jobs are like an intermediary role where you're translating like the knowledge you've gained through experience into data that a company can use and kind of absolve the need for you, the farmer, or the farm service worker. And so it's great because you make this point that for all the claims made about how AI doesn't need humans, it actually still does. But you also talk about how these forms of work disappear with whatever new advance in tech there is. And yet I still feel like the book is actually really hopeful. So I was wondering what you think about this like interplay of automating agricultural knowledge and labor. Like, do you think this is sustainable? Will this continue to create these new job categories that give people the sense of purpose and disappear in cycles? Like, because again, like I should also emphasize, the book does read very hopefully, right? It gave me a lot to explore.
I'm glad. I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's a responsibility to be hopeful. Yeah. Because, so I think there is a way of, I think trying to be aware of the pitfalls while at the same time that hope can maybe put in other structures. So in the case of the agricultural drone operators, I was actually thinking about this the other day. So for context in the book, I visit this agricultural drone conference and they have all these young people who are excited to learn this new trade online, how to fly agricultural drones and go back to the countryside and use these drones to help spray pesticides and fertilizers. And it's environmentally friendly for a number of reasons. But, the presented with this, the company's like, oh, well, we're going to set up this new thing where we'll teach the farmers how to pilot the drones themselves. There can be this leasing system. And you guys who are the first round of drone operators, you'll be like more like data management specialists. And so I think there is a way of viewing it where it's like, the endless pyramid scheme of capitalism. But maybe it's also upon us to like think about how that sense of scarcity or like that there is that kind of end or the top of the pyramid that is also kind of, that scarcity is cultivated by capitalism itself. And there's ways where it's like, okay, so maybe these young drone operators do become data management specialists. And, maybe like there's a way where it's not just like, oh, then their lives become precarious, but there's other ways of like actually turning it into a livelihood that is rewarding, that is empowering, that, is actually sustainable rather than just this one-time thing. I mean, you and I both know this being in California post-election, but like, with gig economy workers, it's like, well, there is actually an opportunity to turn that into a sustainable job with healthcare, with benefits, things like that. But it is those market forces that are like, no, we're not going to have this benefit like accessible to everyone.
Definitely. I mean, when you talk about the ways in which rural people, because of their Macao, as they move into cities, come back, right? Like they're really kind of at the bottom of the like socioeconomic pyramid. Like I love the way you bring that around, because you do talk about surveillance. You know, you interview a police officer. I feel like I have to leave. There's actually still a lot in this book. I promise we didn't give away everything. So we did so much. But without going into that too much, something that really stuck out to me, especially thinking about my research where I do look at surveillance, and, you know, the example you just brought up, right, about gig economy workers, we're seeing resistance from the equivalent of DoorDash drivers in China, right? Like they're paid extremely low wages. They, you know, are working against these impossible systems where the timer is set for them to get the order in, and the amount of money they lose if they don't. You talk about all of this in your book, that like the cards are really stacked against them, and they're not, you know, they're not happy with it anymore. But you also talk, so there's so much about you call it like the powder keg, right, of like young able-bodied men who leave rural areas because they seek opportunities in cities. But in cities, migrant workers, you know, as we both know from our research, as hopefully people following kind of China reporters know, are an underclass, right? They live in temporary housing. They're called urban villages because they're just sort of like, you know, kind of ramshackle dwellings in the middle of major cities. They're potentially going to be over policed, or in some situations are, right? There's this sense that like they need more surveillance. They are more likely to commit crimes. You talk about how this might factor into predictive policing. But I love, so when you talk to the farm service worker, the drone operator, and, you know, he goes to a conference, it's potentially possible his job becomes something that he doesn't want it to be. And he tells you, you know what, you know, I'm a loser, right? A so like, I don't have an education, where are things going for me? And you bring it back around at the end and you talk about 社会人. So I want you to explain 社会人, right? The Peppa Pig meme. And I'm curious about, like, what do you think that movement of people who are unhappy, you know, you talk about how there is this like heteronormative nuclear family propaganda being spread in China. You tie it to rural revitalization, which is this drive to move people back to the countryside, to innovate in all of the ways you've described, as if there were a formula for coming up with these, like, you know, interesting new businesses, but as a way of sort of creating this social stability, when you've proven in the book that, you know, you didn't have to look very hard for people who don't buy that version of reality. So what do you think will happen with these people who, you know, consider themselves kind of on the fringes of society in these ways?
Yeah, it's so funny. I feel like maybe it's generational too, but there's kind of this like this very, I don't know. So with the 社会人, especially, so as context for folks who don't know, it's kind of this almost like nihilistic movement where, you know, related to a few years ago, this meme of like Peppa Pig smoking cigarettes, like just like Peppa Pig being bad. Because I think like I finally did watch regular Peppa Pig, and she's just like, she's trying to like learn how to live, be a nice pig, be nice to others. But like the 社会人 version is like Peppa Pig's like, no, I'm not like swallowing your like, be nice to everyone, be part of society. And it really became the rallying cry for a lot of young people who are just like, well, you know, I'm from the countryside, or I'm from like a 4th or 5th tier city. I don't want to do the like, you know, work insanely hard for this very slim chance at getting into a like college, trying to take the Gaokao exam, you know, and then working like 80 hours a week to try and, you know, get a job at some company. Like the amount of precarity and societal pressure on both blue collar workers, but also white collar workers is insane. And I think that, you know, it's not just China. It's also, as we know, US, many other places where it's this kind of acceleration of like neoliberal, like, you know, work hard, be part of society, be like an entrepreneur, like all these things. So 社会人, I think, is really attached to this like online, like subversive culture. I will say it does feel like there's a bit of nihilism to it, where, you know, it's like, well, we don't want to like 融到社会, like be part of society. And we're like going to like hustle or like find these other ways of like living in the world. I think it is to a certain extent nihilistic because it's not necessarily like thinking through, okay, well, what are the alternative infrastructures that we can build or social structures? It's just kind of rebelling. But in that, I think like there is, for me, also some hope, like that punk rock, like rebellion mechanism is definitely a fire to be kept alive, especially, it's just, you and I talk about this, like the teens, like it's, their subversive potential is much needed in the world.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
We have a great audience questions related to this. So one could assert that for decades, national level policies imposed burdens on rural areas and diverted resources to cities, right? So cities got more resources. You know, under rural revitalization, the realization that the countryside is vital. Plus, he mentioned, right, like there are more people in rural China than urban China. It's something like 8 to 10% of the world's population is in rural China. Do you see that becoming more balanced or inverting? Do you see more resources going to the countryside in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government like is really trying to wield that, sadly, as you and I both know from looking at China's endless pursuit of modernity, it's trying to wield urbanizing places as a kind of control force, right? And I think that it'll just go the path of so many other countries, which is, okay, we'll have these large industrial farms. We don't need that many people farming, get rid of like the smaller farmers, use the giant tractors. It's going to, quote unquote, guaranteed food security in a way that I think especially policymakers of a certain kind really want. And, you know, we'll just like build like more like little settlements for these people who used to be farmers to live in. So it very much is like, I think, a vanishing way of life. Some of the villages that I visited, I would visit year upon year. And like one village that there was only a footpath one year and it was like beautiful. Like you had to, you know, walk there. It was incredible. And then the year after, they got a road that goes directly there, and immediately things started changing. It was going to become a tourist village. And now when I check the WeChat photos of people who I met there, who lived there, it's just like, I mean, it's become kind of a Disneyland. I mean, right now it's more of an empty Disneyland, but it's just, it happened so fast, like over the span of, you know, three or so years. And yeah, and now like the local government has an amount of like reach into the village. You know, before they had this guest house where, so if you got to like this larger town and you took the footpath, like you got to the guest house and the people wouldn't even check your passport. Like you could just stay there. Yeah. Yeah, but, you know, then they put in the road, you can get printers, like all these things, like then the infrastructure for you to be like checked in and tracked is accessible. So yeah, that was sad and wild.
Yeah, now that I think about it, you know, there are these examples of how surveillance cameras and sort of the rest of surveillance infrastructure are making their way into rural areas under projects like Sharp Eyes, Xinjiang. And in a way, you could say that that is resources coming to the countryside, right? That takes money and effort and kind of planning. And, you know, who's to say what the effect of that might be? But I also, for people who haven't been to China or are listening, my shock at not having your passport checked is, you know, as a foreigner, when you go to China, if you stay at a hotel, you know, when you show them your passport at the desk, they're registering you as like a registered foreigner in the country. And I've always found that really interesting because, you know, there are cameras everywhere. There are all these ways to potentially track you, but this still kind of like manual, you know, now, I mean, yes, being input into a computer, but in some places, you know, writing down a form. When I was doing my field work in China, I would leave the country a lot and come back. And every single time I came back, despite the fact that there is face recognition and all kinds of biometrics at the airport, I still had to do that in my neighborhood. And so that's like, you know, really important that there were places in the countryside where you wouldn't have to do that. But as you said, as all this technology comes in, suddenly it becomes part of like this national system and practice. So I want to talk about this. I said at the beginning, you know, we were talking about, is it a China book? Is it not? If it is a China book, no China book will ever like find its place in my heart like this book did, because something I always want everyone to do when you talk about technology and a lot of the theory you brought into it, I feel like it's often not applied to China because China is somehow treated as exceptional or something we can only understand through, as you've said, kind of sensationalized media. You know, I worry about the ability to get the like on the ground field work and kind of facts and variety of perspectives as like the number of journalists in China is dwindling. But I will say, so I love that you name the China tropes in writing about China that you don't like, hilariously, right? I have to, you know, you talk about the seduction of contradiction, right? How people will conjure images of modern gleaming skyscrapers alongside ramshackle food stalls, the chaos of crowds tracked by surveillance cameras. I love this. The steam from a wok reflecting the blue light of an iPhone, like that stock image, we've all seen it. And at the same time, you also talk about, right, like what is China but a projection of American fears and desires? And for China, what is the United States but a projection of desires and fears, right? You know, nationalist dreams stand dull and mute, nothing more than a point between dream and illusion. And there's nothing to be gained by dreaming and everything to be gained by seeing. I love that. So I love, one, that you wrote against these tropes, and your book is just like an exercise in you don't have to write in the tropes. And so two things I want to talk about are these kind of like unexpected perspectives and people that you meet, right? You have this great story of how you tried to get somewhere calling a Didi, which is, you know, the ride sharing, it's like the equivalent of Uber in China. You don't get one, and a regular cab driver picks you up and tells you there's a protest because, you know, army vets aren't receiving pensions. Like, you're getting all these interesting perspectives. You talk to people who self-identify as losers, or people who, you know, are completely just over this illusion of what society is. And you know, you met so many people like that it can't be so hard to find them. So I kind of wondered, did you set out and you kind of were like, I'm going to write the like the anti-China book, right? Like the book that's not, you know, got pandas and dragons on the cover, that starts out with, you know, China aims to be the world's premier AI superpower by 2030. There's none of that in your book. Like, was this intentional? You know, what was your thought process going through that? And then what do you think the kind of effect of writing a book like this is? Like, what were you hoping for in putting it out?
Yeah. So it was very much intentional. But also part of it out of circumstance. So I think that, you know, as I started writing the book, there is a way of writing about tech in China where, I mean, we've talked about this, like you've probably experienced this, where you like go to the tech company and they like, you're trying to get real answers and they send the marketing person. And you're like, I'm doing research, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're like, I'm not writing a PR fluff piece for Alibaba. Like, I'm here to understand what's actually going on. And so it's like, I think it's very easy to fall into that though, right? Because it's like, you know, I think a lot of people do, where it's like you meet with the people who are like at the universities who are making this really fancy tech, and there is this sense that it's performative. And so the reason why I say it's out of circumstance is that, I mean, to put it bluntly, I'm not a tall white man. And I think, I mean, you know, if you're not a tall white man in China, people don't feel like they have to perform for you. Like there's no, you know, people see me, they're not like really going to go out of my way. A lot of people in the countryside, like they're like, oh, where are you from? Like some people thought I was Tibetan because of the way I looked. Other people were like, oh, like, I don't even know, like you must be from Hong Kong, or, you know, there's just this sense like you're not someone that I need to impress. And so as a result, I think there's a lot more honesty. A lot more people, especially in the countryside, thought I was kind of stupid, which I love, because there's just so many things that like I would ask questions and they'd be like, you know, like in the book, I'm like, why don't you raise pigs? And they're like, are you stupid? Like, it's so hard. And like, if I'm going to raise a pig that I actually want to eat, I have to like basically make food for it because they're really picky and temperamental. Or, you know, I had farmers who'd be like, what are you here to see? like, I don't understand. And so I think it is this other, dimension that opens up by the virtue of like not being a tall white man where people feel like they have to impress me. And I think there is a lot at stake in whose voices we center, right? Because it can be really easy to center and to like reiterate the narrative of like, tech is scary, it's going to take over the world, you as a human being are totally powerless in it. And what I actually found on the ground with everything from the Taobao village to people doing rice farming in new ways, but using tech, is this other thing that felt much more empowering. It's like very almost like kind of pirate-like, where it's like, here's this infrastructure that you big tech companies built out, but we're going to kind of hijack this and do it our way. And I wanted to center that kind of creativity and those voices. And it feels much more empowering to write about the self-proclaimed losers rather than like the fancy people in the, the startup office.
I think what I want to emphasize, I think a lot of people don't realize, like having spent a lot of time in Chinese bookstores, like I try, to go to a bookstore anytime I'm in like a major city there that's not a Xinhua bookstore if I can find one. But the textbooks are, either in the business section, or I guess now there's sometimes like a tech section, or maybe they're rarely in like a sociology section, right? But there's a lot of, Jack Ma of Alibaba and Pony Ma of Tencent will like every year have a book of like their business advice, and there's like pamphlets and just all these goofy add-ons. I've got them over there anyway. I buy them in case there's something they slipped up and told me. It never happens. Or they're translations of like the kind of like Kevin Kelly, like kind of tech idealism that I think a lot of people have become really disillusioned with in the United States. And so I love reading your book and seeing, of course, other people. There are other perspectives in China. Like we just have to document them. And so listening to you talk just now, I was wondering, like, what do you think American farmers would say if they read your book?
I feel like American farmers would maybe be very nostalgic, right? There's, it's funny actually. So the American farmers who still manage to exist in this time, a lot of them are quite rich and run these like big, huge industrial farms. A lot of the people who are like kind of hanging on, it's like their family farm and really these struggles to like keep on in the modern world. And I think that it is vanishing, but these Chinese smallholder farmers who are really managing to carve out some kind of like self-sufficiency, some kind of, I really think like a communal freedom, right? Where there is like your village, your community, you're kind of thinking about how the future looks as a group. That's really rare. I mean, regardless of where one's geography is. And Yeah, it's so on a practical level, I actually was talking a lot to this guy who heads up the Center for Rural Innovation in based out of Vermont, and he's a former Google employee who has decided to take on this like new thing for himself. And I think, you know, they kind of want to like copy a lot of these things, right? Like, how do you get people back to the countryside in the US, revitalize these small towns? It's the exact same problem. Like, it's just old people in Idaho. And it's like not a sustainable set of political economies for the US. So yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm curious. I think that guy hasn't finished reading yet, but I'd be curious, like, what he thinks. Yeah.
I have an audience question, and I can't tell if it's referring to the US or China, but you can sort of decide which you know about. And so there's a question of, are the urban hipsters who buy a home in a rural area, right, a significant kind of force? Like, do they stay? Do they help bring like knowledge acquired from their time in the city? You know, I mean, you've done research in both China and the US. Are you seeing this in either place or both places?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I feel like, becoming so common. Like I'm a hipster, buy the home, I can also Airbnb or like, you know, rent it out to visitors, start like my artist residency. I mean, we all have that thought, right? Or like could start our chef artist residency. But so I think ultimately what it hinges on is that acknowledging that like the rural is not just this economic place that's backwards, right? Like in order to do this, you're really entering into community with this, you know, set of people who have been in community for decades, if not hundreds of years. Like there were villages that I visited where it was like, yep, we all have the same last name, and it's been like this for the past like 400 years. And I think that like, if you know, those hipsters manage to enter into community in that way, that will be something that's quite powerful. Otherwise, it's the same. It's just like rural gentrification, basically. It's like, okay, like now we are bringing capital and surveillance and all these other urban forces into the countryside.
There's me too of I feel like it surprised me because this went sort of semi-viral in the US. I can't remember her name, but there's this like young Chinese woman who makes these like very like highly produced videos of like doing simple things in the countryside that are like she'll do them the completely old-fashioned way in like beautiful clothes. But, you know, my first thought was like, this is impractical. There's no way farmers would be decked out in like whatever gorgeous kind of silky garments you're wearing while like, you know, milking soybeans or whatever it is. But people who don't even, you know, speak Mandarin found these videos really soothing. It's just this interesting moment where something viral in China became viral in the United States. I would not want to end this without talking about something else you do that breaks the China book trope, which is you have these great recipes that are kind of like, it reminded me of like speculative design, kind of like design related fiction, where they're not recipes for things, you know, we can like, they're not like cookbooks like this. Like we can't like cook this thing and eat it, but you have, you know, how to eat, there's like how to feed an AI, how to eat yourself, how to eat the world. I don't want to give away what all of them are, but I will talk about the eating yourself, right? This idea that like in a certain future, we would be able to store our data in basically plant matter, food, vegetables, and then consume it. So can you tell me about like how you decided to come up with these really creative concepts? Like one of the things I love about them is it was sort of like science fiction, but it was so easy to plant yourself as the reader in that world and then kind of imagine like, would I eat my own data? You know, you talk about the privacy preserving, like once you digest it and break it down, it's gone forever. So this was so fun. Like just another, the book was perfect already, and then this made it even like more, you know, unique and kind of will stand out forever. How do you decide to do this?
Oh, I'm really glad that you enjoyed them because I had so much fun writing them. And it actually came out because when I first started researching the book, I would stumble across like pretty dry computer science papers that are like, oh, like thinking through like hybrid computing using like, you know, like both biological and artificial neurons. The How to Eat Yourself one, where you're storing data inside plant material, is because a bunch of Microsoft researchers, they were like, oh, like, you know, it's more environmentally friendly to find different ways of like storing data besides computers, which, you know, you have to do a lot of rare earth mining, things like that. We can store data inside DNA. And here's a description of how we did it. And so from there being like, well, I want to write about this and like incorporate it into the book, but like not in a way where it's just like, this is a thing that's happening, but really think through like the weirdness and also general hilarity of it. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So we're getting kind of close to time. I have one more thing I want to talk to you about. And I realized like I could have emphasized it more, but it's, again, like with all of this, talking about it doesn't really fully convey because you walk us through like everything we need to know, you know, to understand some of the concepts and examples you see. And so you've brought up a few times like farmers sent to community. There's a theme throughout the book of like embodiment and disembodiment, right? And this will always come up with technology. You talk about the spatial fix of like, despite, you know, the internet promising that we could live in this disembodied or virtual future, it's how our villages are like very much a material place. So are the other examples you provide. You say farmers embodied understandings of the land, right? So you talk about like their present, that they live in the present and that the future is a created concept. You also say that unlike machines, these farmers accept the responsibility of their actions with the land. They commit to the path of uncertainty. After all, life is defined not by uncertainty itself, but by a commitment to living despite it. I think that's really beautiful. And I just, like, I think about that with this book all the time. I asked you earlier, right, what makes you hopeful? Because this book made me hopeful. That, you know, these are the kinds of stories we can tell about China. And like you know, kind of set this amazing example. But I just was curious, you know, if you've caught up with the farmers, if there's more of this kind of sense of like, we will live through any kind of uncertainty. You know, COVID-19 happened, China is more or less like almost back to normal. Like if you have any kind of closing thoughts on that, because we didn't talk about this certainty, uncertainty, and who deserves the future.
Yeah, I think that embodied experience is so tied to the land and that physicality in a way that I found really moving, right? And also it historically can be very tragic, right? Like when people feel like, oh, their crop has gone wrong and they can't feed their families, like it is this level of tension and precarity. But, you know, I check up on people via WeChat and it's just like, you know, like in the city, like all of my friends and family, they're like, oh, we're locked inside, etc. And then I see like WeChat posts where it's like this guy that I met and he's like out like drying his like this like special tea plant and he's like catching fish from the rice paddies. And he's just like, all right, when everyone can like leave the city, come and visit me. It's getting lonely out here. And like, you know, people are still making rice wine, all these things. And I was just like, I can't even grasp like living in a place like where you're not like, I have to go to the grocery store and wait in line. You're just like, gonna catch some fish like from my rice paddy. And I think I mean, especially urban hipsters now are like, we're going to do that. But actually, it's like way harder than we would like. So I think there is that beautiful like emphasis on like sufficiency or like community sufficiency, self-sufficiency. That's really, yeah, keeps me hopeful at least. Yeah.
Thank you so much Xiaowei Wang. I'd like to remind everyone that the event will be available to watch on demand until the end of November with new subtitles added after 48 hours. The Hong Kong International Literary Festival runs until the 15th of November with 76 live and online events. Thanks for joining us. Good night, and please buy this book. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Shazeda.
Thank you so much.